Don't you just love how Trump loves to tout the success of the American economy, even when it's doing poorly? Well, last week, Trump was standing in front of the cameras calling the American economy rocket fuel. This week, the GDP numbers came in. Canada's economy grew 3.4%. America's economy grew just 1.5%. Canada didn't just beat the United States, it doubled it.
And with American borrowing costs climbing, inflation still too high, and financial markets preparing for the possibility of another rate hike in September, the rocket appears to be experiencing some technical difficulties, let's say.
Yeah, we'll go with that. But Canada appears to be headed for its strongest quarter in more than 3 years, and the data backs it up. This is what has been behind everything Mark Carney has been saying. When he stood up at that press conference and said, everybody wants to do more with Canada except the United States, he was just talking reality. And we have the receipts.
So today, we're going to read through every single one of those receipts with you, because the picture they paint is one Washington is going to have a very hard time spinning away.
So let's start with the Canada numbers, because I don't think many Canadians were expecting this. Heck, I don't think anyone was expecting this at this point. GDP grew 0.3% in May. April was revised upward to 0.6%, and June is tracking at another 0.2%. When you stack those months together, you can see that Canada's economy grew 3.4% from April to June, its strongest quarter in 3 years. Now remember here, the Bank of Canada had a forecast of 2.5% for that quarter, so Canada came in nearly a full percentage point above its own central bank's projection.
Wow, the numbers are impressive, but it is when you look at where the growth actually came from that you understand the full impact. Goods producing industries grew 0.6%. Services grew 0.2%. Mining, oil, and gas extraction, the sector that Trump has been predicting would crater under tariff pressure, well, it grew 1%.
Yeah, the message here is that Canada is kicking ass right now. This wasn't just one lucky sector pulling the average up. The whole engine fired in the same quarter. You don't get that kind of result when an economy is breaking down. It happens when an economy is adapted.
The Bank of Canada also already has done its rate cutting work. So Canada's interest rate is sitting at 2.25%, and there's room to go lower if needed. Now, compare that to the sinking ship across the border, and the contrast becomes almost uncomfortable to look at if you're Trump.
So let's look at what's happening to the American economy, because this is an absolute train wreck. No matter what political pundits and Trump lackeys tell you, America's Q2 GDP came in at 1.5%, which is down from 2.1% in Q1. Consumer spending is still running at around 3.9%, which sounds fine until you look at what is sitting behind it. Prices in America are still rising at 3.7%. The Fed, they want 2%. The economy looks like a Ford Mustang careening out of control.
Now, here's the pickle Washington is stuck in. For months, Trump has been screaming and hollering for Jerome Powell to cut interest rates before he was replaced. Now, Powell, he said no. Now, Trump is still publicly demanding that Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh cut interest rates again. But Warsh and the Fed, they're refusing to give him the cheaper money he wants because inflation remains well above the Fed's 2% target. Cutting rates now could reignite inflation, weaken the Fed's credibility, and push investors to demand even higher returns on long-term American debt. It just doesn't make sense to do it.
So while Canada is operating with a 2.25% interest rate and room to maneuver, the United States is sitting at 3.5 to 3.75%, trapped. Its central bank cannot ease rates, even though Trump is screaming at them to do so. It's a standoff between Trump and the Fed. The bond market, which is basically the world's most ruthless scorekeeper, has already reached its own verdict. When America wants to borrow money for 30 years, it's now going to pay the highest interest rate in 19 years. That is definitely not a sign of confidence. That is a warning.
Canada's 10-year benchmark yield is sitting around 3.6%. The USA is now paying over a full percentage point more than Canada to borrow money over 10 years. So when that spread opens up that wide, it is a huge signal. Markets are pricing in something, and what they're pricing in is a fiscal situation that nobody in Washington is willing to address.
Let's talk about that fiscal situation, because this is the part of the story that deserves a far bigger audience than it's currently getting. The United States federal deficit this year is projected at $1.9 trillion. That's 5.8% of its GDP. Canada's federal deficit is projected at 1.9% of GDP. The USA's deficit is more than 3 times larger relative to the size of its own economy.
And because the United States has been running deficits at a scale for years, it has now accumulated a debt load that costs a staggering amount just to maintain. Net federal interest costs in the United States are projected to hit approximately $1 trillion this year. Not $1 trillion in total government spending, $1 trillion just in interest. By 2036, those annual interest costs are going to project to exceed $2 trillion.
And here's another number that'll blow your mind. This year, America will spend roughly $827 billion, that's almost $1 trillion, just paying the interest on what it already owes. Not building roads, not training workers, but funding hospitals. Just paying the bill for old debt. That's more than America spends on its entire military.
Now look, we're not saying that the USA is about to collapse yet, but the warning signs are there. When a country is paying more in interest than it pays for its military, obviously more than its healthcare, when its 30-year borrowing rate is at a 19-year high, and when its central bank is trapped by inflation that should have been tamed by now, the phrase rocket fuel starts to sound less like policy and more like a headline written by someone who has never passed grade 9 economics. Who sounds like Trump?
Sure does. And his cronies. Now, the United States is paying to borrow money at rates similar to Italy and the United Kingdom, which are two countries not exactly known for their rock-solid finances, right? That's not a neighborhood that the world's largest economy is supposed to be in. Listen, unlike the Trump administration, the bond market doesn't lie. It doesn't spin. It just prices what it sees. And what it sees right now in Washington is a fiscal problem without a plan.
Now, here's why all of this connects directly to what Prime Minister Carney has been doing. Canada's fiscal position gives the federal government genuine flexibility. 1.9% of GDP deficit is manageable. The borrowing costs are lower, obviously. The Bank of Canada has room to cut further, and Ottawa is not boxed in the way that Washington is. When you're negotiating against someone who is boxed in, you don't have to make concessions. You just have to wait them out.
The UAE free trade deal, access to 3 billion new consumers, 175,000 jobs added in 47 days at twice the American growth rate, a record $97 billion in foreign direct investment, and 77% of Trans Mountain's Vancouver exports now heading to Asia, not the United States. Canada is building those exit routes. While Washington was busy announcing slogans and barking at everybody on the planet, Canada is retooling. The routes are open, they're being used, and they're generating revenue.
Now, Canada didn't just sit down one morning and decide to antagonize its largest trading partner. Canada looked at a situation where the U.S. was running a $1.9 trillion deficit, was stuck in an inflation spiral with borrowing costs at a 19-year high, and it decided that it needed other options. Thank God we have a banker in charge. Now, getting other options when your current situation looks like that is the smartest thing any country can do.
Everybody wants to do more with Canada. The numbers now explain exactly why. This is what Carney meant when he walked into that press conference and said that Canada had already won. He was reading a comparative economic analysis to a room full of journalists who had been told by Trump that America had all the leverage. Well, the data says otherwise. The bond market says otherwise. And the countries signing trade deals with Canada, well, they say otherwise as well.
Have you ever wondered why reporters always push back on people like Carney, but they just let Trump spew his lies? I really can't figure that one out.
Well, maybe that's for another video.
Okay, we'll have it come out. But here's the question that we want to put to you, this community, this morning. Looking at these numbers, do you think the USA is in a free fall? And does this show that Canada's trade strategies are working?
Let us know in the comments down below. And when you're down there, check out the pinned comment as well for everything from our private Facebook group to the merch store to that saucy Substack.
Yeah, make sure you check out that because Dave is getting spicy and growing our Substack to one of the top U.S. political commentators on the platform. Woohoo! Go Dave! Thanks for watching, everyone, and make sure to give it a like, a hype, and a share. All of that really helps us out, and we really appreciate it.
We'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.